Fighting games. Love 'em or really love 'em, they've had an interesting history. For example, what forced the recall and re-release of thousands of Street Fighter cabinets soon after their initial release? What led to the early 2000s decline of fighting games and their revival a decade later? And what game did Capcom debut as their greatest game of all time? Hey, Tak here, let's get stuck in. Now, we could start in the late 70s when you might think that bell-bottom pants and tie-dye would make it difficult to skirt around a fighting arena. And you'd be right. Sega's 1976 Heavyweight Champ might be the earliest fighting game by right, but due to its hardware limitations, it's more akin to an early graphical experiment as much as a fighting game. Vector Beam's 1979 Warrior offered a top-down perspective with two line-drawn characters holding swords. Again, while this technically was a fighting game, it was a far cry from representing anything we compare to the modern game. In fact, we need to jump forward to November of 1984 and the release of Kung Fu Master to really see the fledgling fighting game in a more simple form. Why Kung Fu Master? Well, a few reasons really. Firstly, it was a side-scrolling beat-em-up, but it made serious headway not just for the beat-em-up genre, but for the games industry more generally. The team that worked on it learned how to implement side-scrolling effectively, and themselves would go on to make other titles like Super Mario Bros, for example. Before Kung Fu Master, games had almost exclusively taken place on single screens. What it lacked in flashy graphics or lightning-quick gameplay, it more than made up for with the ideas that were under the hood. When we talk about standing on the shoulders of giants, Kung Fu Master is very much one of those giants we're talking about. Would we have been able to understand its importance at the time? Probably not, but like any defining moment, it's often with retrospect we see how important something was. Now, whilst it was a beat-em-up, it also included one-on-one boss battles that showed health bars in the side view, which would be a rudimentary template for fighting games that came after. Perhaps most importantly, designer Takashi Nishiyama, a name synonymous with fighting games, would be heavily inspired by early development in Kung Fu Master and would go on to create some of the most important games in the development of the genre. 1984 also saw the release of Karate Champ, developed by Technos Japan. It allowed for the popularised player versus player matches. A variety of moves could be performed using the dual-stick controls, and it also featured numerous arenas in which players could fight. The culmination of these games paved the way for Capcom's 1987 release, Street Fighter, designed by Takashi Nishiyama of Kung Fu Master. Arcades at the time were largely dominated by shoot-em-ups and beat-em-ups, with titles like Contra, Twin Cobra, Double Dragon, and Operation Wolf dominating the cabinet space. However, among these, Street Fighter found its niche. Part of the game's appeal was that it used special moves that could only be discovered by experimenting with the game's controls. It created a sense of mystique and invited players to practice the game. Players would literally spend hours in the arcade, pumping coins into the cabinet to figure out the secret combo moves to wow and defeat other gamers. As well as being engaging for the arcade goers, it was good business for the arcade owners, something that can't be understated. Following Street Fighter's lead, command-based hidden moves surged in popularity and became a main staple of the genre. It drove the progression of fighting games into ever more surreal and fantastical places for character special moves, so that gamers felt rewarded when they discovered something new. Blocking also became an integral part of the game, allowing players to focus on their defensive strategies as much as their offensive ones. Up until this point, most games that involved elements of combat had focused solely on the offensive. By including some, if very simple defensive options, players were given a choice of how they wanted to play. Capcom had originally and somewhat foolishly released Street Fighter with pressure-sensitive controls which influenced the strength of the attacks. The damage it caused to thousands of cabinets as eager gamers smashed the buttons trying to perform ever more aggressive attacks led to a quick replacement with a 6-button control scheme, offering light, medium and hard punches and kicks. I think that's what Bob Ross might call a happy little accident, as the idea of 6-button fighters proved extremely popular among players and multi-button schemes became another staple of the genre. At this point in time, we were entering the third generation of home consoles. The NES had released in North America in 1985, and the Master System and Atari 7800 in 1986. They were, however, largely ignoring the genre, and the home of fighting games was very much in the arcades. Now, I had asked you which game Capcom had debuted as its greatest game of all time. Any ideas? Before I answer that, if I can indulge you for just 5 seconds and ask you to consider subscribing to the channel and throwing a like on the video, it helps me out a ton and lets me know if you want me to keep making these videos. Right, back to it. In 1991, Street Fighter II released and rocked the gaming industry, turning the tide of arcade popularity from shooters and beat-em-ups towards the fighting game. It refined lots of staples that had come before it and took advantage of modernised graphics to include highly detailed characters and stages. But perhaps what would prove to be its most popular update was that it also included the most accurate joystick and button scanning routine to date. This meant that the execution of multi-button moves, which previously had required an element of luck, could now be performed with skill. This gave rise to the fighter as a truly competitive game, as players could rely purely on their skills that they were gaining in the arcades. Skilled gamers also learned combo mechanics, realising they could combine several attacks together that left no time for the opponent to recover if timed correctly. This created a second reason for gamers to spend hours pumping coins into the games before challenging rivals. It also provided more incentive for arcade owners to stock the games. Street Fighter II's success led to the dominance of fighters in arcades, and its critically acclaimed home release a year later would make it the defining template for fighting games. In the same year, Takashi Nishiyama, the designer of the original Street Fighter and Kung Fu Master before that, released Fatal Fury. His title focused more on storytelling and timed special attacks. It was popular in its own right, but failed to reach the levels that Street Fighter II garnered in the early 90s. Street Fighter Champion Edition, released in 1992, further balanced characters' abilities for competitive play and also unlocked 4 additional characters which had originally only featured as bosses. A further update less than a year later, Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting, further balanced characters' attacks and introduced faster playing speeds which proved popular with competitive players. The golden age of fighting games was truly upon us. Studio Midway Games would achieve unprecedented notoriety in the same year with their release of Mortal Kombat. It featured digital characters, and its dark mythical setting enticed gamers to learn the numerous secrets hidden within the intimidating world its characters inhabited. Unsurprisingly, its biggest draw was its fatality system, which allowed you to kill your opponent in gruesome and grisly ways at the end of the match. The ability to wow a rival not only with the discovery of a special move, but also by being able to rip their spine out at the end of the match was like catnip for fighting game gamers. The game quickly earned a reputation for its gratuitous violence and was adapted for home game consoles. The home version released on a day promoted as Mortal Monday. The advertising resulted in lineups to purchase the game and a subsequent backlash from politicians concerned about the game's violence. Despite its success, Mortal Kombat did not review as critically as the Street Fighter series. In fact, it was often compared negatively to Street Fighter II's Kombat, but its theme and gore helped to propel it as a mainstay in the fighting niche. In 1993, Sega released Vitrua Fighter, which was the first 3D fighting game. It offered a viewpoint that zoomed and rotated with the action, but despite the graphics, players were confined to back and forth motion as seen in other fighting games. With only 3 buttons, it was easier to learn than Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, which had 6 and 5 buttons respectively. By the time the game was released for Sega Saturn in Japan, the game and system were selling at an almost 1-to-1 ratio. The slightly less well-known battle arena Toshinden is credited for taking the genre into true 3D, due to its introduction of the sidestep maneuver. IGN described it as one little move that changed the fighter forever. Other titles had experimented with allowing players to move in the foreground and background, but Toshinden implemented it as part of the moveset and gave players more defensive options beyond the popularised block. Other experiments were also taking place. The release of King of Fighters 94 had players choose from teams of 3 characters to eliminate rather than just the traditional one-on-one combat. With a yearly release, developers SNK would ensure that the King of Fighters series would be another regular go-to in the fighting game market. Despite its Champion and Turbo updates, fans were impatient for a full release of a new Street Fighter. This meant that by 1995, Vitrua Fighter and Mortal Kombat, which was on its third main title, became the dominant franchise, with Street Fighter Alpha unable to match the popularity of Street Fighter 2. It was around this time that cracks started forming in the fighting genre. Both the Street Fighter movie in 1994 and the Mortal Kombat movie in 1995 had been a critical and commercial flop, and the bandwagon that many developers had jumped on to profit from the success of Fighters' popularity had become very saturated. Even so, it would be a few years before we would see the fighting game boom turn to a bust. For anyone following along at this point, you may be well aware that we're missing plenty of titles that are synonymous with the modern fighting game, and you'd be right. The market was getting crowded, but there were still a few gems out there that would surprise and delight gamers, both casual and competitive. Hit the subscriber button and make sure you join me for the second helping of this fascinating history as we cover the decline and renaissance of fighters and talk about titles like Dead or Alive, Soul Calibur, Tekken, Guilty Gear and even Super Smash Bros. Until then, I've been Tak and you've been just marvellous.